Hello, and welcome to another episode of Lessons from the Dragon's Library. I am your host, Xamot, also known as Trevor Bierschbach. I use that phrase because I'm also a gaming streamer, and that happens to be my gamer tag. But now I'm putting on my writer's hat, my author's hat for you to bring you a second sort of writing lesson, mini seminar on writing. Things that I've learned, things that I've learned from other authors, things that I've learned doing it myself. I have published one novel and one short story collection. I've actually make that two short story collections. I keep forgetting the most recent one. You can find my books on Amazon. You can find them at shows that I'm doing. You can find them through my website, trevorbierschbach.com, and all the links and everything are in my video description below. So that's kind of what I do. I'm a relatively new author in the grand scheme of I haven't published a lot of books. My first book was published relatively recently, but I've been writing for a long time. So as far as practicing the craft, I've been doing it a while. And so I think that's I do a lot of reading, some of the writing. It's given me some insights. I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot through making a lot of mistakes. But one of the big things that I did learn, and I want to remind everybody, and I won't say this every show, but I will probably remind you from time to time, there is no one way to write. Pardon me. I didn't log out of my... I work from home for a tech company, and I forgot to log out of my IP phone. Sorry about that. But this is a live show, and because it's a live show, I actually encourage people to interact with me. Ask me questions if I'm going too fast, if I'm not covering something that you wanted to hear. Please do speak up. I really want to hear that. And why is the chat not enabled? Give me 1 second. I don't see the chat enabled in my stream window, and that's not good. I won't be able to see you guys if you ask me questions. Where's the chat window? Oh, this is unfortunate, but we're doing a live show. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm actually going to... that's really frustrating that I can't see the chat window. I'm gonna pop it up over here on the on my laptop. So if you guys ask me questions, I'm gonna try to watch for those. Chat has been disabled for this live stream. That is not intentional, people. I'm so sorry. Give me 1 second here. Why is the chat disabled? Enable the chat. I guess because I made it... Well, that's really unfortunate. So the chat is disabled. Unfortunately, I can't see if you guys ask me questions. But do ask me questions in the comments. I'm going to figure out what happened because I want these live streams to be interactive. I want to answer your questions in real time. Unfortunately, I can't do that on this episode. But if you do have questions, you have comments, please put them in the chat window below or in the comments below the stream. When this is over, I will do my best to answer your questions and any suggestions or anything that you have. But anyway, back to what I was saying. I'm going to remind you in this, and I'll probably remind you periodically, that there's no one way to write. Nobody can tell you how to write. Another author can tell you how they do it. Another author can tell you how they got published or how they got found by an agent or how they construct scenes. But they can only tell you how they do it. So one of the things you really have to be conscious of is people out there telling you that there's only one way to do it, or their way's right, or your way's wrong, or blah, blah, blah. You have to take all the information you can find, adapt it to your style, use what works, throw away what doesn't, and do your best. That's all you could do. So I'm going to give you what works for me and suggestions that I've had and things that I've learned, but I can't teach you how to do it. I can only tell you how I do it. So keep that in mind through all of these podcasts, that's what this is. So I'm going to try to give you a tip every time. One quick thing that I've learned over the years that's just general to writing, things that aren't necessarily specific to one type of genre or style or the day's topic. My most important tip, the most important thing is you need one of these. It's a little notebook. I carry it in my pocket, and I always have a pen. I really think that you do yourself a disservice if you don't have a way to get your thoughts down immediately in hand, wherever you are. It doesn't matter where I'm at. I've worn this thing in my kilt to Irish Fest. I put this thing in my pocket, whether I'm wearing a suit, jeans, shorts. When I leave the house, this goes with me, as well as a pen. That's the biggest tip I can give you. That's your tip for the day. Make sure you have some way of getting your thoughts down on paper so that you can refer to them later. So, on to the topic. Using death in your writing. Death is a very touchy subject for a lot of people. Everybody has had different experiences with death, different levels of experience with death. Some people have been impacted by it or affected by it in their personal lives, lost immediate family members, whether it be siblings or parents or children or spouses, significant others, best friends. Some people have lost people that are immediately close to them, and some people haven't. So when you are considering using death in your writing, you need to consider your audience. Is probably the most important thing when you are considering how to handle a death scene or how to handle the death of a character. If you're writing for a young audience, be aware that most children, especially children in Western countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, most of Europe, most of them have not experienced death in their personal lives. Now, depending on their age group, they know people die. Some of them may have lost grandparents or great-grandparents. The further away from their parents these deaths are, the less effect it will usually have on the child. And children are also very it's very easy for them to cope with things like that when it's not really close, when it's not really immediate. It's children tend to bounce back faster. Their brains heal faster. They are able to compartmentalize these things better. Now, I'm no psychologist. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of it because I don't really know all of that. But I can say from when I lost my grandmother when I was 21, even then, losing my grandmother was much different for me at 21 than losing my mother was 4 years ago. So adults and children and even young adults, they're all going to have different experiences with death. So make sure you're writing for your audience when you're considering this. Also consider if your audience is much older and they experience death on a more frequent basis. Older people who have lost spouses and friends and brothers and sisters, and maybe they're the last surviving member of their particular generation in their family, they've become more used to it, more hardened to it. So they will take death completely different as well. So make sure you're considering that and using that knowledge in your writing. You're not going to want to write some horrible death scene that's very brutal and graphic into a young adult novel and expect the reader to be affected the same way they would be as you if you put that in an adult book. You're just not going to get the same impact out of that. Something that you want to make sure that you're considering when killing a main character, and that's probably the biggest part of it. Death happens all the time in books, and bear in mind, not every book has to have death in it. I'm mainly talking about adventure books, science fiction, fantasy. It's pretty common. Books that deal with war, books that deal with horrible trauma, those kinds of books. Now, if you're writing a romance novel and you're not actually using death as a form of moving this romance plot along, your book, nobody has to die. And nobody has to die in a fantasy book or an adventure book either. It's not that we want to make sure that you understand, or make sure your reader understands, that death is a possibility, especially when you're writing a book where danger is part of the plot. But it doesn't mean it has to happen. But you need to make sure that your readers know that you are willing to hurt or possibly kill your characters. Because otherwise, if it's a book about danger or adventure or war, and your readers aren't convinced that you're willing to do those things, then they aren't going to be invested in the characters. And we're going to talk about some of the examples of why or how that's become a problem in certain literature, certain types of books, is when you no longer care because there's no stakes. There's no longer any reason to expect your characters to be hurt. But one of the big things is when you make the decision to kill a main character, that's a hard decision to make. And some books only have one main character, and obviously if you kill your main character, then you no longer have a book. So we're not talking about killing the protagonist here, but you can. Killing the protagonist is something that can be done, say, at the end of a series or the end of a trilogy, or if it's a one-book series. If it's just a one and done, telling this character's life and which culminates in the character's death, that's obviously something you could do. But there are other main characters you can have in your book, and sometimes the death of those main characters, I don't want to say useful, because death shouldn't be a useful thing, but it can be very effective in telling a story or in character development if it's done correctly, and if it's done with a conscious purpose to do that. So you want to make sure it has an effect. You can't just kill a main character and then pretend that they no longer exist and it no longer has any effect on the story. If a character can be killed and it have no further effect on the story, that character shouldn't have existed to begin with. So that's something you need to remember. You don't just kill off a character just to kill off a character. Otherwise, why'd you even put him there to begin with? So it shouldn't just be to drive the plot forward, but it should noticeably change the story by them not being there. You want your reader to get to moments in the story after the character's death and realize how different the story would have been if that character was still there. When you removed, for example, and I didn't write an example for this one, but imagine the difference you would have had at the end of the Harry Potter series if Dumbledore had still been alive. Dumbledore's death was extremely traumatic for Harry. It was traumatic for a lot of the characters. It had a big effect on Snape. If Dumbledore had still been alive by the end of the series, it would not have gone the same way. It would not have progressed the same way that it did with him dead. So you want the death of your main characters or your primary, secondary characters to be that way. You want your reader to stop and think, oh, if so-and-so were still here, that wouldn't have happened, or this would have been much different if that had been that way. So always keep that in mind. Make sure that they are that important to the story that your readers do that. Another example or another thing about killing your main characters is it has to have an effect on the other characters in the story, the other main characters in the story. It doesn't have to have an effect on all of them. Maybe the person maybe you have a small group of main characters, a group of friends or a group of adventurers or a group of travelers that are going along together, and they don't all get along. Um, if somebody doesn't like the character that's died, or is ambivalent to them, doesn't have any feelings for them whatsoever, they may not be affected by that character's death. Uh, or it may come up. Maybe they're hiding some sort of how they feel about that character. Maybe they did like them, but they didn't want to show it, or maybe they loved them and they didn't feel like exposing those feelings. Then that character's death may come up later as something that changes them. But it should change some of your characters, because that is, not only does it show your character development and give a reason for that death to have happened, but it gives your audience a reason to feel the loss of that character as well. So one of the examples I had, and I'm going to use this book a couple times, my favorite book, Dragonlance Chronicles. It's actually 3 books, but the Dragonlance Chronicles by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman. This was the first series of books that I read where the death, the loss of a character, had an effect on me. I'd read probably a couple dozen fantasy books up to this point, and all of them had loss and trauma, but this was the first time that reading the death of a character made me stop. It made me put the book down. It didn't make me cry, but if I had had a different relationship with death when I read this book, if I'd been older, it probably would have. I can imagine myself now, after having lost both my parents recently, if I had read this book now and have never read it before, just read this book for the first time now, it probably would have made me cry. So that's where depending on the age of your reader, you're going to have a different effect with your death scenes. But one of the things that I wanted to point out is how it affects characters to have a death scene. And first I wanted to go back to, so in Dragons of Winter Night, which is the middle book in this series, you have a character named Sturm Brightblade. He's a knight. He is he's a very loyal, very honorable person through the first book and most of the second book. He's a tragic character. He desperately wants to join this order of knights, who won't have him because his family is in dishonor, and he gets thrown into a leadership role of sorts because of this war that's going on. And then you have another character, Lorana, who is an elf. When you first meet her, she's very young, she's very naive, she's very spoiled, and she becomes a representative of her people with the humans who are fighting, and she winds up with Sturm in this keep, defending this keep called the High Claris Tower. And so Sturm has a very tragic and heroic end. He goes down fighting a dragon rider called a Dragon High Lord, who is leading the evil army in this particular series. And the scene of his death is very impactful, but that's not the part that really matters as much. But one of the things I wanted to point out was the author. This is the annotated version of the Chronicles, so there's notes by the authors in here. And I think this is a very interesting note that Margaret Weiss put in here, because as a writer, I've heard this before. I've heard some people say that writers enjoy killing characters, or writers get some sort of pleasure out of offing their characters. And that, maybe it's possible that there are some authors like that, but I don't believe that's true to most extent, because we as authors grow to love and know these characters as much as we know ourselves, and to kill one it can be very traumatic for an author. So she wrote in here, "We had no idea that Sturm's death would cause such an uproar among the fans, We received tons of letters from fans who were shocked that we would actually kill off a hero, despite the fact that we had foreshadowed his death through 2 books. A fan once accosted me at Gen Con, accusing me of not caring about Sturm. He's just a character to you, the fan told me. In fact, Sturm was not just a character. Characters become a part of you. You get to know them better than family and friends sometimes. It was terribly hard for me to write this death scene. I was crying so by the end that I had trouble seeing the computer screen, and I cried again when I had to write the funeral. So that's kind of important because it shows that as an author, killing off a character shouldn't be that easy. Killing off a hero, one of your main characters, should be difficult. And if it's not difficult for you, then it's possible that you haven't built that character up into enough of a person that your reader's going to care either. And maybe you need to go back and look. If you enjoy killing off a main character, an empathetic hero, or whatever it is, if it doesn't affect you even a little bit, there's the possibility that you need to readdress this character. Go back and make sure that you've made them empathetic enough that your audience is going to care. Because if you don't care, why are they going to care, right? But the part that's really important about this, so remember I told you that Laurana is very spoiled. She didn't want to be, she gets thrown into this leadership role as a representative of her people. She didn't want it. She was very young. She was very spoiled. Even one of her childhood friends, who is another character in this book, basically called her a spoiled brat. And so after Sturm's death, after she learns from Sturm the meaning of honor and integrity and loyalty, and to see this human, a creature that lives like the blink of an eye to an elf, after seeing this human show more compassion and honor than she had seen in almost anybody else, his death had an effect on her. So at the funeral, Laurana, who is, like I said, she's put in this leadership role, and she gets up in front of all the knights and everybody to address them. She says, "You expect a noble speech," she said, her voice cold as the air of the sepulchre. "A noble speech honoring the heroic deeds of these men who have died. Well, you won't get it, not from me." The knights glanced at each other, faces dark. "These men, who should have been united in brotherhood, forged when Kryn was young, died in bitter discord, brought about by pride, ambition, and greed." Your eyes turned to Derek Crownguard, but he was not totally to blame. You are, all of you who took sides in this reckless bid for power. A few knights lowered their heads, some paled with shame and anger. Lorena choked on her tears when she felt Flint's hand slip into her, squeezing it comfortably. Swallowing, she took a deep breath. Only one man was above this. Only one man here among you lived the code every day of his life, and for most of those days he was not a knight, or rather he was a knight where it meant the most, in spirit, in heart, not in some official list. Reaching behind her, Lorena took the blood-stained dragon lance from the altar and raised it high over her head, and as she lifted the lance, her spirit was lifted. The wings of darkness that had hovered around her were banished. When she raised her voice, the knights stared at her in wonder. Her beauty blessed them like the beauty of a dawning spring day. "Tomorrow I will leave this place," Lorena said softly, her luminous eyes on the dragonlance. "I will go to Palanthus. I will take with me the story of this day. I will take this lance and the head of a dragon. I will dump that sinister bloody head upon the steps of their magnificent palace. I will stand upon the dragon's head and make them listen to me, and Palanthus will listen. They will see their danger, and then I will go to Sancrist and to Urgoth and every other place in this world where people refuse to lay down their petty hatreds and join together. For until we conquer the evils within ourselves, as this man did, we can never conquer the great evil that threatens to engulf us." So Lorana, who was at the beginning of this story a very spoiled, very naive, very young woman, who didn't want anything to do with leadership or being the general. They make her the general of this army, and she doesn't want to be. The death of Sturm and the realization that this one great thing that she had seen in her life was gone, pushed her to be more, pushed her to become more than just the golden general, just a figurehead. So that's one of the things you want to make sure you're considering when you're writing in a death scene. Make sure it has an impact on some of the characters around that person who died. Now, not every scene has to be dramatic. Not every death scene has to be the fall of a hero or falling in battle. You don't have to. Don't forget that some people die peacefully in their sleep, and there's nothing wrong with that. Some people die from ailments. And if your heroes, make sure your heroes are not immune to the ravages of normal life. One of the traps we can fall into when we're writing heroic fiction, especially, is that everybody is heroic, everybody has to go down fighting, everybody has to go down with the ship. No, some of your heroes can grow old and die, and it makes them more normal, which is a good thing. You don't want all of your heroes to be demigods that everybody looks up to and thinks, oh gosh, Hercules is so amazing. We relate to normal people sometimes better than we relate to those heroes. So there was another example from the same series of books that I wanted to point out, and originally I pulled this passage out because I wanted to use as another example of how it affects characters around them. But when I saw again Margaret Weiss and Tracy, both their notes on this particular scene, I changed this a little bit to point out, like I said, not all of your heroes have to die heroically. So Tracy Hickman wrote of this passage, most death in the world is quiet, which sometimes blankets the fact that it is the consistency of a person's life that brings meaning to their existence. Not everyone dies defending their country or saving children from burning buildings. Some of the greatest heroes I have ever known lived strong, supportive, and truly great lives in small communities. Their names may not have been heard beyond a 100-mile radius, yet they were no less heroes. Those are the types of heroes that most people know. They don't know the guy who picks up a sword and shield and marches off to save the world. They know, the school teacher who stayed after class to make sure that the one struggling student passed the test. They know the hero that gave up all of his free time to help work in soup kitchens, even though he barely had enough to eat himself. Those are the heroes that people know in their own personal lives, in their own communities. So when you make your heroes sometimes closer to them than to Hercules, you can make them more empathetic to your audience. So this scene here, and this is a tough one because there's another character in this series named Tazelhoff. Tazelhoff is a Kender. A Kender is a race of beings in the Dragonlance world that are very childlike. They're not children, and they're not mentally unsound. They're not, they didn't develop slow or anything like that. They're very childlike in their view of the world. They're very innocent. They're very unafraid. They're very inquisitive and curious. So Tazelhoff is best friends with this dwarf named Flint. Flint is the grandfather of this group. He's old. He has a heart condition. He's been alive for like 250 some years, which for a dwarf in the Dragonlance saga, that's old. Flint has fallen down while they're traveling, and he had a tussle with one of the other characters who's run off, and they think that they hurt Flint. And they realize that he didn't. Flint managed to snort, "Harm me? He couldn't harm a mouse, Tanis. He's as gentle as Tika." The dwarf smiled up at the girl, who also knelt beside him. "You take care of that big oaf Caraman, you hear?" he said to her. "See, he comes in out of the rain." I will, Flint, Tika wept. At least you won't be trying to drown me anymore, the dwarf grumbled, his eyes resting fondly on Karaman. And if you see that brother of yours, give him a kick in the robes for me. Karaman could not speak. He only shook his head. I'll go look after Barum, the big man mumbled. Taking hold of Tika, he gently helped her stand and led her away. No, Flint, you can't go off adventuring without me, Taz wailed. You'll get into no end of trouble. You know you will. It'll be the first moment of peace I've had since we met, the dwarf said gruffly. I want you to have my helm, the one with the griffin's mane. He glared at Tanis sternly, then turned his gaze back to the sobbing Kender. Sighing, he patted Taz's hand. There, lad, don't take it on so. I've had a happy life, blessed with faithful friends. I've seen evil things, but I've seen a lot of good things too. And now hope has come into the world. I hate to leave you. His rapidly dimming vision focused on Tanis. Just when you need me. But I've taught you all I know. Everything will be fine, I know. Fine. His voice sank. He closed his eyes, breathing heavily. Tanis held tightly to his hand. Tazloff buried his face in Flint's shoulder. Then Fizbin appeared, standing at Flint's feet. The dwarf opened his eyes. I know you now, he said softly, his eyes bright as he looked at Fizbin. You'll come with me, won't you? At least at the beginning of the journey, so I won't be alone. I've walked with friends so long I feel kind of funny going off like this, by myself. I'll come with you, Fizbin promised gently. Close your eyes and rest now, Flint. The troubles of this world are yours no longer. You have earned the right to sleep. Sleep, the dwarf said, smiling. Yes, that's what I need. Wake me when you're ready. Wake me when it's time to leave. Flint's eyes closed. He drew in a smooth, easy breath, and then let it out. So that actually kind of chokes me up a little bit. So Flint had a hero's death because he had a hero's life. He wasn't struck down in battle. He wasn't killed by a dragon. He didn't die saving somebody's life. But he had a heroic death. And at the end, he saw the truth of the world, the truth of what had been going on in that moment, and he was at peace. So that's also a very effective scene in a book where a main character dies, and it does have an impact on all the characters around them. Tazelhoff becomes less innocent. He becomes more mature in a way, and it changes everybody around them, the death of Flint Fireforge. And it has an effect on the reader, and it's having an effect on me right now. And I haven't read that scene in probably 2 or 3 years, I think is the last time I read that book. And that's tough. Reading it now after having lost people close to me. So you can see that's how you want to do it. You want to make sure that it's not too much, that it's just right, and that it has that effect, and it should have an effect on you. I can't imagine, I've had to hurt characters, and I've had to kill secondary characters in my stories before. I don't think I've yet killed a main character, but I know at some point I will have to. And I hope that I have built the character, written the character well enough that it has that kind of effect on me. So the next topic the next part of this that I want to go over is the opposite, the extreme. Something I'm going to call the Wolverine effect. If you guys aren't familiar, Wolverine is a Marvel character. He's an X-Men from the Marvel universe. He's a mutant. His powers, basically, he has a healing factor. He heals constantly. He's been alive for like 150 years or something. He grows old very slowly. He can't get drunk. Whenever he gets cut, he heals. I've seen Wolverine die multiple times in the comic books, and the problem with that is over time you slowly lose any concern for Wolverine's safety. I've seen Wolverine fly a spaceship into the sun and come back. More recently, they had a Death of Wolverine series shortly before I stopped reading Marvel Comics, in which he was encased in adamantium, which is like strong. It's the metal that coats his bones. It's supposed to be like the only thing he can't cut through, and he died. But after they write Wolverine's death, and after Wolverine dies, they write a series of stories about his friends dealing with his death. And then more recently, they brought him back. And so here's the problem with the Wolverine effect. Not only do you lose concern, give me a sec, I'm going to push the door closed. Sorry, wife came home and I didn't want to disturb her or pick up too much sound. Anyway, the problem with the Wolverine effect is even before that time, I lost all concern for Wolverine's safety. Like I said, I knew that if Wolverine died, he'd be back. He'd get stabbed and shot and thrown into the sun and eaten by alligators and whatever, and he'd come back. So whenever they'd put Wolverine in danger, it had no effect on me. I didn't care because I knew it wouldn't matter. So the only way you could really use death in a Wolverine story to make it matter is to put his friends in danger, which can be troublesome too. So it's something you want to avoid. It really only works once. And usually when you have a character with special powers or you're writing some sort of story about reincarnation or something like that, you can use it. But if you use it over and over again, your audience is going to lose concern for your character. Because who cares if they die? They're just going to be back tomorrow or next week or next month. So after Wolverine died and they wrote all these stories, about his friends, they sort of invalidated all of these great stories they wrote about how his friends dealt with his death by bringing him back. And to me, that's unfortunate because here's these great stories that now no longer matter. And that's something you want to avoid. That's also brings up magic in fantasy. So that there's a problem with the separation between fantasy gaming and fantasy literature. In most fantasy games, there is magic that can heal people and bring people back to life. Especially, let's say, our biggest example I've been reading from Dragonlance books. Dragonlance are based on the Dungeons and Dragons game. One of the things that they really avoided in the Dragonlance books was using really high-powered healing magic. And now in a lot of the books, that kind of magic just isn't around because clerics, priests of deities who can use that kind of magic are pretty rare. A lot of books deal with magic like that by either making that kind of magic really expensive, as in the cost to either the caster or cost of materials or whatever is really high, or that magic is really rare. If your world, especially a fantasy world, has a way to bring your characters back to life whenever, then death and danger have less impact on your audience. They have less impact on your story. If you've got a group of adventurers going around, fighting monsters or fighting in a war or trying to defeat some bad guy, and there's somebody in the group that can heal all their wounds in the blink of an eye, danger no longer matters. Because who cares? Like, so what? They get in a fight, and at the end of the fight, they all get healed. Well, that's how an adventure works in a game. That's how it works in Dungeons and Dragons, for example. You guys go into a dungeon, you all fight the monsters, your cleric heals everybody, and then you do it all again the next day. That works great in a game. It doesn't work great in a story. So make sure if you are writing fantasy and using magic, that you put restrictions on the kind of magic that can invalidate the danger you're putting your characters in. Otherwise, your audience isn't going to care. You're basically writing an adventure book with no stakes. And that's the one thing you want to avoid. So, moving on from the Wolverine effect and using magic, something to remember is cultures. And this podcast is going to go on probably a little longer than most because this is a big topic. Remember that cultures look at death differently. Whether it's ancestral worship, which was in, don't shoot me if I'm wrong on this, but in older Japanese culture and in Native American culture, reverence for ancestors. They believed that the afterlife was more than just heaven or nothing. They actually believed they could contact or get blessings from ancestors. The Egyptians believed in a different afterlife than Christians do. So remember, different cultures are going to look at death differently. So if you are writing a book that has a lot of cultures, keep that in mind. But also, when you're writing, consider your audience is going to have different, the way they look at death is going to be different. One example that I have from my own writing is the Elves of Thelos, the fantasy world that I write my stories in. They believe, so when they get bonded to another elf, they exchange what are called soul stones. And they put a piece of their soul in the stone and exchange it with the person they're bonding to, so that these 2 or 3, however many people are involved in this bond, when one of them dies, they believe that the bond is forever, so that they believe that that soul, that person, is waiting for them in the afterlife. Part of their cultural belief means that after they bond with somebody, they don't bond with anybody else. If they form a partnership or a bond or what we would call a marriage with 2 or 3 or 4 elves, that is forever to them. So while these elves are sometimes promiscuous up until the point of bonding, a very free love society, if you will, once they make that bond, that's forever. And so they wholeheartedly believe that their bondmate is waiting for them, so they won't bond again. And that's how they look at death. So the way they deal with death is different than how somebody who doesn't believe in afterlife might deal with death. These elves truly, honestly believe that their loved ones are waiting in an afterlife. It's similar to the Christian belief of heaven or the pagan belief of Tirnanog. So that's part of their culture, and that's how they believe in death. They also don't believe in ghosts because they believe the soul moves on. There's no exceptions to this rule for them, so they would have no reason to believe that the ghosts of their ancestors are haunting anything, and they also would have no reason to pray to their ancestors. It's just not part of their belief in death. But a different culture in Thelos would have a different view on death, so make sure that you're considering that. A good example would be the Jedi from Star Wars. After they die, if they are powerful enough, they do become what are called Force ghosts, and they can appear to students or friends to give advice, to help them with situations. So the Jedi have a very different view of death than somebody who doesn't believe in this power would have. So that's something you want to consider when you're writing death into your stories, especially if you're writing fantasy. But even if you're writing real-world fiction, consider the cultures you're writing from. Consider how they believe or how they view death, and the afterlife, whether it exists or not, things like that. So make sure you keep that. Always make sure... Moving on from that, always make sure that your readers know, and I think I touched on this a little bit before, but make sure your readers know no one is exempt. Even your protagonist. Your readers have to know you are willing, if your story is an adventure story or it has danger of some sort, your reader has to know you're willing to hurt, maim, kill, whatever. It sounds brutal, it sounds horrible, but you cannot have a type of character, and I've seen arguments for this, and I vehemently reject the idea that a certain type of character, whether it be because of their race or their sexuality or their orientation or their religion or whatever, it does not matter. None of your characters can be exempt from the same things you're going to do to any of your other characters. It does not matter. All the tropes about whatever it may be, don't let those discourage you from writing a real story. If you have one character that's exempt from all of those things, your audience is not going to care about that character as much. If it's a story about danger, if you put that character in danger and your audience goes, they're going to be fine, you lose all of the conflict and all of the drama around that situation. Your readers are going to be like, they'll be okay. It's just like when you're watching The Walking Dead. Let's say The Walking Dead, for example. We know there are certain characters that are probably not going to die, and some of them have already proven true. Did they kill Rick? Sorry, spoilers if you haven't seen it. No, Rick didn't die. Rick's gone. Rick's not dead. And so whenever Rick was in danger, you kind of knew he was going to be all right, because you can't kill Rick. You don't really want characters like that. Now, there was always the bug in the back of your head with those, because they were willing to kill pretty much everybody in that show. There was still that nagging voice that said, well, they might. They still might. Like, you were pretty sure Rick wasn't going to die, but he still could. So you want to make sure that even if you do have a character where you're looking at that character going, I'm never gonna kill this character, make sure that you work in that voice of doubt in your audience. Otherwise, like I said, you're going to lose any sort of conflict or drama when you put that character in danger, because they know they're going to come out of it. Your audiences knows, well, he's going to come out of it fine. Now, sort of the same thing goes when you consider the effect of death on your characters. Tertiary characters. Now, if you're not familiar with the word, you have your primary characters, your main characters, usually your protagonist and maybe a few friends of theirs. You have your secondary characters. Usually those characters have names and they're part of the plot, but they're not part of the main plot, or they're part of little subplots, or you don't see them very often. And then you have tertiary characters who are in there for one scene, maybe the barkeep that everybody likes because he's a nice guy, but he's not really part of the plot. He's just there to make the world feel alive. That's a tertiary character. Even when you kill a tertiary character that isn't like, yes, when you kill a bunch of people in a war, that should have an effect on someone in the book. Lots of someone's in the book. Maybe show how that affects other tertiary characters, like their family members, the village that lost all of their men, or whatever it is. But sometimes it should have an effect on your main characters too. For example, a Game of Thrones. A Game of Thrones opens with, I'm pretty sure, I'm trying to remember the first chapter and separate it from the first scenes of the show. But if I remember right, the first chapter of a Game of Thrones opens with Ned Stark executing one of his bannermen, and I don't remember exactly why. But Ned Stark is teaching his son Robb how to govern as an honorable man, and he says, if you are willing to pass down a sentence of death, you need to be willing to carry that sentence out yourself. It's a very good sentiment. It's a very honorable thing. It's something you would expect the Ned Stark character to do. So that had an effect on Robb through the rest of his life, which unfortunately Game of Thrones and that series, Song of Ice and Fire, is notorious for using death. sometimes to an extreme. We'll talk about that in a second. But Robb Stark was affected by that through his whole life, even to the point where when it came time for him to pass judgment on somebody, he took it upon himself to carry out the sentence. He did not believe that he should have somebody else do it. And it was one of the things, it was one of those moments that showed the type of man Ned Stark was. And it showed, it was an example for Robb to follow, to try to become the same man his father did. And ultimately it led to the same demise, which is one of the problems that you can get into with how you write death too. So we're going to move into, and our final point here is quality over quantity. To me, Song of Ice and Fire goes to an extreme. It takes all of these points that I've made and pushes them beyond what I would consider, or where I would write anyway. I still enjoyed those books, but I got to the point, I got almost to the opposite extreme of not caring because I didn't think any characters were in danger. I stopped caring because I knew they were probably all going to die. If that makes sense. I didn't really... I got to the point while I was reading the book going, well, don't like this character too much because they're not going to be around that long. And to me, I think that is just as bad as not caring because you don't think the character can actually die. So when you're writing, make sure that your death scenes, your trauma scenes, your injury scenes, whatever they may be, make sure they're good, make sure that they have a reason to exist, and make sure you don't get gratuitous with them. Don't kill characters just to be that guy that killed. Don't be George Martin just to be George Martin. The only reason I think it works in A Song of Ice and Fire, sorry if you hear music back there, the only reason I think that works in A Song of Ice and Fire is because the books are so long and the story is so good that you can sort of ignore that fact. But it's also a book about some very, very traumatic periods in this world's history, so a lot of people get killed. But it does get to the point where it's almost like heads rolling just for the sake of heads rolling, and you want to avoid that too. So anyway, I've dragged this on almost an hour. This is a little bit longer than the lessons I do intend to have, I think, anyway. I do like to ramble and go on and talk and talk. So hopefully this has been informative and useful. I've got show notes. I'm not sure if they'd be interesting to anybody, but if so, let me know. Drop it in the comments that you want to see the show notes. Also, ask questions. I'm going to try to figure out why the chat didn't work in this particular stream versus all the others I've done where it's worked fine. I'll try to figure that out so that we can make this more of an interactive thing, because that's what I really want. I want you to be able to ask me questions and make me go back to topics in real time. You can also check me out on Twitter at TJ Bierschbach and on Facebook, Trevor Bierschbach Writes. I know my last name's hard to spell. If you look at the video description below, you will see links and how to spell it all and how to find me and all that other stuff. Go to trevorbierschbach.com, sign up for the newsletter to keep on top of things. I will be sending out the new newsletter soon and drawing the book winner for April from new subscribers. Every month I draw from that month's new subscribers, and they get a free copy of When Heroes Rise, which is my short story collection. And I think that's it. If you watch the live stream, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here. If you're watching the recording, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, let everybody know about the show, do all those cool things. I will love it very much if you do. You guys have a great one. I will see